Well, this is an overview, and this is going to be kind of the way I fly. I like to fly really high most of the time, but sometimes they do get down low. So there might be some spots here where we get close to the ground, but for the most part, it'll be high. In my mind, it's extremely important to always have the mindset that God planned everything from the beginning to the end. And we always have to have that perspective when we're studying. When we get too close to things, we seem to forget what God is actually doing. God had a plan when he created the universe, and there were a lot of details in that, and that's what we've been doing throughout history, is living out, seeing those details. God created everything that we know of and know about here, and then after all of that, he created man. And Psalm 8, of course, says that he made man in order to have dominion over the works of his hand, which is crazy knowing what we know about us. But if we go back and think about what God created when he created man, a perfect man, a man of incredible intelligence and capacity, it's more credible then. But, of course, that did not last long, and God had to respond to that. But God had a plan. He knew that was going to happen. The other thing we should always keep in mind is that nothing ever surprised God. He already knew that was going to happen. He knew about the fall. He knew about what man was going to become before he brought the flood and changed the earth, the environment a little bit, so that things were no longer the way he had originally created, and not even the way they were right after he cursed certain things on the earth and in man. In Acts 17, Paul says that, telling the modern culture of his day, the Greeks and Romans, which we are a real good copy of, he said that he made from one man all the nations of mankind to live on the earth, having determined their times and the locations of their habitation. God had that all in mind, and he is fulfilling that through history. So when we see the stuff that we see in 2 Kings and 1 Kings and elsewhere in the Bible, this is not out of God's control, and it's not out of his scope, and he is working his will through all of this, in spite of the fact that it looks crazy. Sometimes it's just we cannot comprehend it. And if we really understood what was going on after the fall, as mankind developed, and the thoughts and intents of his heart was only evil continually, we can't comprehend how horrible of a place that must have been. And God's solution to that, using the word as a pun, his solution was a flood. To start over, does anyone remember what changes were instituted with Noah and his descendants after the flood? A couple of big points. Capital punishment was the one. And what was the other one that we really appreciate in this day and age? Pardon? Well, that was a consequence for sure, but we're talking about being able to eat meat. So the dietary rules were changed. Before that, we understand that everything was vegetarian, including the dinosaurs. But a lot of things changed after the flood. So, again, God had that in control, and as man developed again after the flood, which immediately we see the effects of sin in man, then they decided to rebel against God in a big corporate way, and we still have the land and the name of the place where that happened, Babylon. And God, they wanted to stay together, they wanted to combat God, they wanted to reach God on their own terms, and God did what to solve that problem? He created different languages. How about that? Amazing. And we see the effects of that. And again, this is a big study. You can spend your whole life studying the effects of that, seeing how ethnicities are actually language-based and basically nothing else, and they become isolated in certain parts of the world. It's all a very fascinating study if you live long enough and have enough time to study that. Probably not the best thing to do. Also, God had his people in all of this. He started with 2, and they rebelled, but he took care of those 2 persons' problems and promised them a final solution, which we see in Jesus. So, as you read through Genesis, you see how the populations are spreading out and the people are spreading out, but God has his finger on certain people until we get to Abram, and God gives him a specific covenant which involves God's promise. Again, we got to remember that God knew all of this before it happened. He wasn't surprised. He isn't surprised at any moment. He isn't surprised what I did yesterday and what I'm doing tomorrow. And when he made a covenant with Abram and changed his name to Abraham, he knew everything that would happen. You know the stories of Jacob and Esau. You know the stories of those kids of Jacob's and the flow of biblical history. But God had his mind and his finger and his plan in all of this. God had a promise, and he's going to stick to that promise. So he created a nation, and he did that by letting them become slaves in a foreign country where they were protected while they developed into a large nation. And then with his outstretched arm and mighty hand, he delivered them and put them into their own land against their will, with them kicking and complaining all the way through. But he still brought them into the land and gave them all those blessings. But along with Abraham, God still loves everybody else. And he did other things with other people. We have the book of Job. He does not appear to be any relation to Abram or Israel. We just recently studied Daniel, how God showed serious concern about Nebuchadnezzar and worked in his life grandly. And these are all lessons for us to know that God is paying attention to us and is working in our lives. No matter how hard we try to mess it up, no matter how foolishly we do mess it up, God is still going to do. If you are called, if you have God's Spirit living in you, then He is in control of our lives. And that we can be grateful for. So as we come on through history, the flow of history, we studied the judges, and we were scratching our heads and saying, how can all of this be? But God wasn't surprised at any of that. And through it all, what's the most important thing for us to remember?
God is in control?
He's in control, and as he is in control, he loves people. He loves the people he chooses, and he does not ever throw us away. We have the promise in John 10 that those who are in the Father's hand, nobody can grab away, and those who are in Jesus' hand, no one is going to take them away. And that's all of our squirming and kicking isn't going to get us out of his hand either. We need to remember that. To me, that's the thing I was most impacted by going through Judges. He did not turn them into a righteous, holy nation at that point at all, but he provided for them, he was kind to them, and he blessed them and got them through that. He gave them judges who were not particularly great guys, but it was showing God's care. And we have to remember that at the same time as we study Judges, you have to remember what was happening in that same time. You had the story of Ruth that happened in that same time period. We have the story of, who else? Esther was later. Rahab, yes, coming into that. Ruth, I don't know where my brain went. Sorry. Jeremy told me to keep my notes thinner, but then things fall out of here, and it takes me a while to find them on the floor. In any case, God is in control, and good things are happening at the same time terrible things are happening. We see this. We can look at our own history, looking at recent history, all the amazing good things that God was doing in Germany and around the countries involved with that, all the terrible, terrible things, but yet God is still at work, God is still in control, and nothing goes on that God doesn't permit, and a lot of good things go on that he makes happen. And so that's really what the story of the Kings are, the book of the Kings, and then the one book of Kings and Samuel and Chronicles. But we have the history and we have to deal with it. So what we see in 2 Kings is divided. Did you like my phrase up there? Divided, depraved, and then they are destroyed. So my goal this morning is, after that long spiel, time isn't up yet. I want to stir up your appetites of the whole Bible, especially the harder parts of Leviticus and Numbers, Judges, the down slope of the nation of Israel, and even looking through as you study. You need to study. You need to read about this, find out about what happened in the 400 years between the end of the Old Testament revelation and the beginning of John the Baptist. What was going on in there? Was God silent? Was God invisible? Was God taking a break? He's there working just well. It's just different, and we are always need to be surprised that we need to not be surprised that God is still working and alive. God is very long-suffering. The common word you like to translate that is patient, but long-suffering definitely befits his attitude towards us, because he does suffer. just like we suffer when our kids do stupid, destructive things, we suffer along with them, and we will suffer a long time. And God is the inventor of that attribute. He also has eager grace. He is quick to forgive and quick to bless those whom he loves. At the same time, he is righteously angry, and he should and does slap us and even crush us. There are we can cause more distress and discomfort than we realize if we want to be hard-headed. God will still love us and take care of us and take us to glory, but we might be totally removed from usefulness and any appearance of being his follower before he takes us out of here. But we are all his critters. The people around us who aren't here this morning because they're not holy enough, but he cares for all of mankind, and he is constantly working in this world right now. We have been created by him for his pleasure, and his creation is intended for our good, and his love for us and his discipline of us is all for our good. We are very fragile, very, very totally, completely, utterly dependent on him for every tick of our heart, every breath. We are helpless on our own. And it's so sad to see people thinking they are so big and great, because all you need to do is hold your breath for a little bit, and you'll see how great we are and helpless. And we are fallen. We are terribly self-focused. We definitely, even we who have the first fruits of the Spirit, even we ourselves groan within ourselves, eagerly awaiting the adoption, the redemption of our bodies, in which he will transform us finally. But we can look forward to that. So, 2 Kings. This is the divided nation. That happened in 1 Kings, way back there when, after Solomon contaminated the nation of Israel with his many wives and their many gods, he actually himself helped construct and accommodate all these horrible worship practices that went through there. And yet God, in his patience, did not destroy the nation in Solomon's life, even though it was his fault. It was his actions. Utterly amazing how long-suffering God is. And then his son was even worse for 5 minutes. Thankfully, God pulled the carpet out from under him really quickly, and he did repent and did some changes. But in the process, he lost the kingdoms. He lost the whole kingdom. Could someone read 1 Kings 11, 6 through 9 for me, for us? Go ahead.
1 Kings 9.
11, 6 through 9.
Solomon did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and did not follow the Lord fully, and David his father had done. Then Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the detestable idol of Moab, on the mountain which is east of Jerusalem, and the Molech, the detestable idol of the sons of Ammon. Thus also he did for all his Now the Lord was angry with Solomon because his heart was turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice.
So the warning there is for us. Solomon, the wisest man God ever made, and yet he was able to turn. And yet God was long suffering with him. Could someone get 2 Chronicles 11:16 for us?
Got it. 11:16.
11:16. 2 Chronicles.
He also strengthened the fortresses and put officers in them and stores of food. Am I in the right spot?
Yeah, I'm probably out of order here. This is talking about the divided nation.
2 Chronicles
Yes.
11.
Okay, well, that's my point. I just didn't give a good lead up to it. So how did the nation get divided? Somebody remember except the teacher from last week?
David,
How did it get divided?
how did it get divided?
Because of the ceremonial idolatry that Solomon had with his wives, and having this wealth and distribution, and all that was involved in that, and him worshiping different types of gods.
Different gods,
and
yeah.
all that.
Okay, well, that's the why. How?
Jeroboam led a rebellion.
Well, Jeroboam wanted to follow in his daddy's rich footsteps and wanted to make sure he wasn't paying for all this excess that Solomon created by taxing the people more to cover all the expenses. I mean, when you make all kinds of stuff, what happens? When you have big fancy cars, big fancy houses, or even little ones, what do you have to do to them?
Maintain them.
You have to maintain them. It all costs money. Everything goes downhill. So that was true of all of the stuff that Solomon had built and was provided. Yes, sir?
One of our own poets has said, "Mo money, mo problems."
And who was that? Oh,
Biggie Smalls, I don't know.
so yes. So that was what motivated Rehoboam. You know, when you grow up a spoiled kid, having everything given to you, living in opulence, you want to continue that lifestyle after the fact. And when people come and say, "Hey, this is too hard for us," what are you going to do? Well, yeah, I'm bigger than my daddy. And so, yes, I definitely messed up on my reference there. But we know the story. The northern kingdoms, the northern tribes, said, "Forget you. You know, we're not even related to David. Let's get out of here." And so they left. But they had a guy leading them doing that. And his name was Jeroboam, which always makes me uncomfortable. But anybody get that? Yes, oh, it's very close to Jerry Bowman.
Not related, Jerry.
Anyway. But he instituted competitive worship, and at the face of it, there may have been some maybe good intent in because he just duplicated what Aaron had done a long time before that. And so anyway, he made 2 golden calves. He made 2 so that one would be in the southern part of the northern kingdom, the other would be in the northern part of the northern kingdom. And so there was some really stretched relationship to the God who brought them out of Egypt. But those golden calves weren't the ones that brought Israel out of Egypt. And so it was utterly false worship, and it got really bad, kept going downhill. So that was the division. So Rehoboam, the grandson of David, only had Benjamin and Judah tribes following him, along with all of the Levitical people who had faith. And I thought I had the verse for that, but I'm not seeing it here. They came, anybody who wanted to still worship God in the northern kingdom emigrated to Judah, and they lived there. So you had a mixture of not just Benjamin and Judah down there, but you had certainly a lot of the tribe of Levi, and then any other people that couldn't stand what was going on in the northern kingdom moved down there. And so that's why you see in the New Testament people from Asher and lost my memory there. Anyway, in the New Testament, in Jerusalem, you'll see like the Anna at the temple. She was of another tribe. There were people living down there, even Paul. No, Paul was Benjamin, sorry. But there were other people living down there. So that, and they knew who they were, even though we may call them the 10 lost tribes. They still knew who they were back there in the time of Christ. And I apologize for losing that, but the point is you're supposed to study 1st and 2nd Kings 2 and read this, and you'll find that. And you may get it brought up next week when we go through Chronicles. 1st and 2nd Chronicles. So the next thing that happened at the division was I don't know why, but Jeroboam tried to pull on Abe Lincoln and fight them and unify the nation again. But God stopped that right away. He said, don't do that. Those are your brothers. This was my plan. Don't do that. So they stopped. They actually didn't start the Civil War right then. But in the kids that followed did fight against each other. If someone would grab 1 Kings 15:6, and someone else get 1 Kings 15:32.
I got 15:6.
Let's do 15:6.
Now there was war between Rehoboam and Jeroboam all the days of his life.
Okay, and 32.
There was war between Asa and Baasha, king of Israel, all their days.
So there was constant conflict between the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom up until we get to Jehoshaphat, and whoever's quick could read 1 Kings 22:44. Actually, I'll do it. I've got it right here. Jehoshaphat also made peace with the king of Israel. And this gets into another phase here, which is where we are going now. I'm going to just give you a quick list of the kings of 2nd Kings. Covered 1st Kings already. This is mostly 2nd Kings. So we have Ahab is on this list. He's actually in 1 Kings, and he has actually died, and his son Ahaziah starts reigning. So the lines aren't straight across there, but the Ahaziah is the king of Israel. That's the other thing I forgot to mention. In Kings, 1st and 2nd Kings, you have history of both the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. When we get to Chronicles, you'll see that it focuses mostly on the southern kingdom of Judah. But through here, you're constantly bouncing back and forth, and it becomes really can easily be confusing because you have a guy with the same name, like we have Ahaziah in the northern kingdom, and you have an Ahaziah in the southern kingdom at a different time. They have a lot of popular names. You know, they had their Johns and Bills and Jakes back then too. So you have to pay attention when you're reading that. You almost have to be taking notes or have a study guide with you because it can be very confusing. The confusing thing is that Jehoshaphat, who was a good king, married Ahab's daughter, Ahab and Jezebel. And you probably know that story, right? You've heard those names. Two of the worst people you ever want to run across. How many people ever considered giving your daughter name Jezebel? You just don't see that around much anymore. But Jehoshaphat married their daughter, and her name was Athaliah, and she comes into play afterwards too. So those are the names of the kings of Judah and Israel, along with their years of reigning. And there is a few things to point out, like Ahab's son Ahaziah. You see how long he reigned there? Yeah, he was in there 3 years. It wasn't 365-day years, but one, and then a couple on each end. And the Ahaziah, don't name your kids Ahaziah. See how long he reigned there in the southern kingdom? It just was a very sad period of history. It's not much different than currently, but anyway, there are a lot of assassinations going on in both kingdoms. The northern kingdom certainly had the most of those. So, and I have to find my list here. Part of your job when you're studying is to notice what the writer of the Old Testament, or the Kings and the Chronicles, and how they evaluated the kings. And so you can pay attention. But I'll give you a quick list here as soon as I find it. Nobody ever accused me of being over-organized. So I'll go on through here. The southern kingdom was the better kingdom because they did try in a fashion to keep worship of God there. Many of the bad kings in there, of the 20 that ruled in the southern kingdom, only 8 of them are called good kings. And some of those were really good kings, and they did their best to purge all the idol worshiping and bring everyone back to the real God of Israel. But again, it's just a sad thing. So you have here in 2 Kings, we have Jehoshaphat, who was a good king, but at the end of it, he wasn't too smart, marrying Ahab's daughter, and at the end of his life, he went to war with Ahab, and anyway, study that yourself. My memory just isn't as good as it was when I was 35, I guess. But he was still listed as a good king. It's just that at the end of his life, he messed up. Then his son, Jehoram, who actually lived a little bit, but he died pretty quickly. And then his other son, Ahaziah, became king for a little while. And then his mother killed all of the rest of the sons of that could have become king. She went and killed all of them, except that her sister saved one of them, Joash. But he was just a baby of just practically newborn when she saved him. And so she hid him in the temple for 6 years. And then the high priest arranged a coup and brought him out, a 6-year-old, crowned him king. And at that point, they dealt with Athaliah, who was reigning as queen for those 6 years. And she was a really, really bad woman. You can study about that. So Joash became a good king, and he was in there for 39 years, looks like. But also he kind of collapsed at the end of his reign too. Then on the kings of Israel, you have the Ahaziah, and then Joram, and then Jehu. And we know Jehu is famous for what? He had a real hot sports car, because it says he drove furiously. But, pardon? But he was, I haven't gotten into the prophets yet, but he was told by Elisha that he was going to take over the kingship of Israel, and he was supposed to purge the descendants of Ahab, which he ended up doing. But even though God gave him that authority and the rule, he still did not honor God, and he continued the idol worship. He was not a good guy. And then we will move on further down, but just to say that of the kings of Israel, of the 13 kings of the northern kingdom, not one of them followed God, not a single one of them. And so that is why we get further down the list here. Let me try that. Again, if you take time in your study to look, some of those people did not live very long as kings. On the north kingdom, Amaziah lasted a good long while, and he was one of the good kings, and his son Uzziah, otherwise named Azariah, some places referred to as Azariah. He was also a good king, and you'll remember him from the book of Isaiah. It was in the year of Uzziah's death that Isaiah had his vision of the throne room of God. And his son Jotham did okay, while those other guys were just coming and going pretty quickly in the northern kingdom. It was a bad time. And then you get down to, on the north, you have, a lot of kings in short order, because that nation did not last as long. So you have Jotham in the southern kingdom, Ahaz. You remember Hezekiah. There's an interesting detail on Hezekiah that he was going to die. God told him to get ready because he was about to die, and he was in his bed sick, and he was bawling and saying, "But I did so good." Complained to God, and God said, "Okay, I'll tell you what, I'll give you 15 more years." And about the same time as he got well, he had another child named Manasseh, or Manasseh. I'm not Jewish or Israeli, so I don't know how to pronounce it, but Manasseh, and he was a really bad guy. It's interesting that God gave him a son after he gave Hezekiah a son after he was going to die, that became king, and a bad king. He didn't learn from his dad. Except that at the end of his reign, God really afflicted him badly, and he did repent at the last few years of his life. But his son Ammon did not do any good whatsoever. So you see on the northern kingdoms, you have Pekaliah, Pekah, and Hoshea. And there's a line through him. His years of date. Do you know why that is?
The Assyrians came knocking.
They came knocking, and he died in Assyria. They took him captive, and so he was still listed as their king, although they had taken over the nation. So he lived till 1712, but they were invaded and conquered in 732. So the rest is the list of the kings of Israel, and they did not last either, another 100 years or so. And the last four kings, well, from Manasseh on down, Josiah was the son of Ammon. Ammon was a bad king, but Josiah was a good king, and the rest were all bad, indicated by how long they reigned. Well, that's interesting. I lost. Oh, okay. Any questions up to this point? Didn't give anybody any time to ask questions or make comments. I'm not the first person that has studied this, so I know you guys all have thoughts on the subject, especially you older guys.
Question. Yeah, I have a question. Well, it's more of a remark, but.
Good.
All right.
I'm better with
I
remarks
don't
than
need
questions.
the description of an older guy. Is it still all right if I speak?
You're older than some people.
Okay, we'll take it. So I was just looking through chapter 23 during the reign of King Josiah there, and just, if there was any question about the absolute vile stuff that Israel was doing, it's given in great detail as Josiah was cleansing it out of the land. I mean, we're talking, there's Molech there with the child sacrifice. There were male cult prostitutes and horses dedicated to the sun. Asherah poles. In the temple, they had hung woven hangings for the Asherah. And there's also altars there that had been put up by Jeroboam and Solomon that had been there for over 300 years in Israel. It doesn't end there. It talks about mediums, necromancers, household gods and idols and abominations that he cleansed out of the land. I mean, these people were evil, like if there was any question. And it apparently got so bad that by 26, it says, even though he cleaned all of it out of the land, even though he established the word of God, verse 26, chapter 23 says, still the Lord did not turn from the burning of his great wrath by which his anger was kindled against Judah. Like, even all that wasn't enough to say, these people have adequately turned aside from their sin, and of course his son comes in and just pretty much undoes everything his father had done.
Yep, he was the last.
We looked briefly in the sermon last week at Passover, how important Passover was. And something I found last week in that study, the only time in 1st and 2nd Kings where Passover is even mentioned at all is during Josiah's reign. So all those hundreds of years, this holiday that they were supposed to celebrate every single year, the only indication that they ever did it was under Josiah's reign. It's pretty crazy.
It is crazy considering the guys that went before him, the Uzziah, the Hezekiahs. It's just really astonishing how depraved we really are. Even at our best, we still stink pretty badly.
Well, and I
And
think
we're reminded of that every day now.
we look at the kings of Judah and the kings of Israel. We look at what's his face that was married to Jezebel,
Ahab.
Ahab, and the wicked things that they did. I mean, I think it was Solomon said that there's nothing new under the sun, and it hasn't changed. You see it in our society right now. I mean, there is no question that you've got idol worship and the embracing of depravity. We live in a fallen world, and it's only God's mercy that it continues.
Yes, another famous poet of ours has said, "We have met the enemy, and he are us." Well, unfortunately, I spent too much time talking about the bad stuff. We still haven't talked about the prophets. So Elijah was the first prominent prophet, and we know, I assume if we have any acquaintance with the Old Testament, we remember him and his attempt to purge the nation, the northern kingdom. So you see, the ones on the right are prophets to the northern kingdom. The ones on the left are to the southern kingdom of Judah. But the prophets of Baal, he did a good job of clearing out Baal worship, and he's at the same time, approximate time, that Jehu was called to be king in northern Israel, and he also did violently finish cleaning out Baal worship from northern Israel. It was, if you want to read a ghastly story, there's a place to go. But they were terrible people, terrible practices. Idol worship is a terrible disease, and it makes us do the most awful things, as we can see in our own nation. How many things we do, have done legally, just because we are worshiping ourselves. So Elijah was a big man, and then right after having that visual demonstration of God's power, God is the only God, and having fire come down out of heaven and burn up that entire sacrifice that we heard about last week, the next thing he does is run from a woman. And runs out in the desert and says, I'm going to die. I may as well die because I'm no good. I'm no better than my fathers. And God, of course, corrected him, but that was the end of Elijah's life, because the next thing he did is he called Elisha to be his descendant. What's the right word I need there?
Apprentice, or successor?
Successor, yes. So yes, he apprenticed with Elijah for about 6 years, and then Elijah was taken by God into heaven without dying. One of the two in the known history. In there also is Micaiah, who we only have in one chapter. And then Elisha comes on the scene, and he is a prophet all the way to the northern kingdom until the time of Joash. But he did some amazing, great things too. And we have lots and lots of stories. So those are the good stories to read in 2 Kings. As you see there, he's first introduced to Elijah in 1 Kings 19, but then he becomes the main prophet to the northern kingdom in 2 Kings chapter 2. Out of that same time period then is Jonah and Amos and Hosea, all of which we have as the minor prophets or the little prophets in the Old Testament. So you can read all those. Joel was one that also complained to the southern kingdom. And it's interesting how few of the prophets were assigned in the early part of the kingdom of Judah, even when some of those bad guys were reigning. Then you have a series of them at the very end of the history of the southern kingdom. And of course, there are lots and lots of stories about those people, and that's for you to read. Read. Those description that Sam was reading about, Ezekiel was the prophet who was actually in exile, but still being a prophet to the southern kingdom, even though he was in Assyria. He even had visions. He actually dug a hole through the temple wall and saw all of that junk that was in the temple. Very interesting. It's important to tie in those prophets in with the history going on in Kings and Chronicles. It's hard work, but learning is hard work. Don't shy away from it. Jump in with both feet. So there's a lot of things to be said. I'm just going to say that leaders are significant to nations. Their character is very significant to nations. One of the things about fallen man is that he wants to worship and follow anything but God, and any man will do. And so we choose leaders after our own appetites, and it's just a sad thing. Our fallenness is a great weight hanging on us and on our choices and on our decisions and on our appetites. We can see even the kings, even the good kings, had deficiencies. Some of them ended up really poorly. Joash, who was the kid who was made king at 6 years old, he was a good king as long as the high priest was alive. As soon as the high priest died, he went on his own and started doing terrible things and ended up killing that guy's, his protector and mentor. He killed his son, who was high priest at the same time. So crazy stuff. It's all inside. We see it all in the mirror whenever we look really carefully. So, God is long-suffering. That's what I want you to remember today. God is long-suffering, and he has eager ready grace. He does not enjoy beating his children. He will, and he must, and he does it in love. But he is so pleased to give us his grace, give us the strength in troubles, which I feel certain are coming, maybe sooner than later. Just look at history, how quickly things can change. Certainly in this case, a guy gets up one morning and he gets assassinated and everything changes just like that. So we need to remember that we are his critters. We are his creation. We are not our own. We belong to him, and he created us for his pleasure and for us for our pleasure. And we are dependent, utterly, totally, completely dependent on him. Any other comments?
Good job.
Job? Job was a good guy, yeah. Don't go saying that.
Quote of the day, we are his critters. I like that.
Well, you know where that one came from. That was a Lee phrase.
Oh, what?
He always he always called us critters. Creatures.
All creatures great and small.
Let's be dismissed and enjoy each other and cherish the fellowship of God's people and build each other up. And see you next time, but not next week, hopefully.